to start off. And so firstly, thank you everyone for coming here today. I know the days are on very busy agendas for everyone, lots of side events going on, lots of really interesting things happening across the full COP agenda with both the negotiations and pavilions and in our official side events. But firstly, we're going to cover off today on how the GST is presented as this critical opportunity for us to land an integration around climate and biodiversity synergistic action across the UNFCCC, the CBD, and the Rio Conventions more generally. So it's clear for us that the urgency is here. Achieving 1.5-degree world is unattainable without halting and reversing biodiversity loss and ensuring we get those critical safeguards in there for Indigenous peoples, local communities, and other marginalised groups. We've seen plenty of dialogue across the COP here, across the week so far, around why biodiversity and climate synergistic action is really important. We've seen this in being raised on the floor by negotiators, we've seen it in side events, and we've seen it in the ministerial level events as part of the action agenda, and really being led well by our high-level climate champion. But until it lands in the text, our job here is not done. But today we're going to explore this a bit further in a bit more detail around different solutions, different perspectives of all the things that come in under that biodiversity and climate synergistic action. So we're also going to have plenty of time for audience participation at the end. So please do gather some questions in your head, and after we've gone through the series of presentations by our panelists here, we'll turn over to Q&A as we go forward. So please do have them ready. But first off, I'm going to turn to our first speaker, Melanie. So Mel is our Head of Global Policy at the RSPB, which is BirdLife International within the UK and the largest conservation organisation in Europe. She's worked on the nexus between climate and biodiversity policy for many years, attended her first COP in 2008. So her focus at this COP is on ensuring nature's role in climate ambition is recognised, particularly within the global stocktake. And we're keen to hear more. So over to you, Mel.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Rhiannon, and really great to be here to have this conversation with you. If we can have the first slide up, please, that would be fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, this is a really exciting time to be having this conversation about nature's role in the global stocktake, because as we speak, we know that conversations are taking place behind closed doors on exactly this. And as negotiators discussing it, we've been reaching out to them with our key messages, which I'm going to share with you today. Next slide, please. Oh, I've got that. Oh, sorry, that's down to me. There we go. So yeah, picking up on what Rhiannon was saying, it's been really, we just had Nature Day yesterday. It's been really exciting hearing the momentum from leader-level events, from ministerial events, from high-level events, from side events on the synergies between biodiversity and climate. I mean, I have been involved in this process a long time, and we have never had more conversations about this and more kind of commitments from countries at the national level. It's really exciting. But of course, we haven't won it within the global stocktake space until we see that ambition actually landing in the paragraphs. We've heard some countries speak out to our asks, but not everything that we would like to see has made it into the text. So we're really keen to share with you what that ambition looks like for nature and climate. So how do we channel all of these events, and you're seeing some of them on the screen, into that space? So have we reached that tipping point? Well, the first thing that we see that will really take us into an ambitious place is clear linkages from this process here to the CBD. So the science is really clear that we can't tackle these issues in silos, but we're not seeing that join up in policy at the moment. There is some language in the current text proposal that speaks to this, so we very much hope that we can hold on to that. But it's absolutely critical that the CBD's Kunming, Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is name-checked, and that policies in the GST are specifically said to be aligned with this, and that's one of our key asks. Of course, we can have that join up, but if that doesn't take place at the implementation level, then we're still not winning. So equally critical is that we have NDCs and indeed national adaptation plans and long-term strategies aligning with the biodiversity plans that exist under the CBD, which is the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans. Now, again, we've seen some really heartening momentum around this, not least with the joint letter that's going into the presidency from a number of countries yesterday. The joint declaration, we have our colleagues at WWF have produced a report on how this can be done. There is, again, considerable momentum, but really keen to see this land in the GST text. I next wanted to touch on a critical concept that really helps land ambition in this space, and that's really recognizing the role of ecosystem integrity. And if we have that language in there, then we solve a lot of the challenges that we face. And I mean, I think the pictures tell their own story. Here you can see that difference between an ecosystem at the top that has real ecosystem integrity, that's flourishing with biodiversity, versus a picture that I took on holiday when walking through a plantation, a monoculture plantation in Scotland, which was devoid of biodiversity, rich in carbon, devoid of biodiversity. So ecosystem integrity is really critical because it's essential for the long-term carbon storage. That monoculture plantation will have a very short lifespan, but we need the long-term carbon storage in our ecosystems, not just from the mitigation perspective, but because also it provides threats to the kind of climate impacts that we're seeing, such as droughts, wildfires. It locks up that carbon, minimizing the losses to the atmosphere. Provides preventative measures against the potential tipping points that we might see as forests are increasingly exposed to, forests and other ecosystems are increasingly exposed to climate impacts. And biodiversity plays a functional role within that ecosystem integrity. So if we can get that language, and we've seen Australia put that forward on the floor, if we can get that language, that would be incredibly helpful. Article 5 of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement has an article all about the role of ecosystems and the importance of conserving and enhancing sinks and reservoirs, but there's no work programme to discuss that. There's no negotiating track at the moment. So we try and get language in to cover decisions out of this process into the global stocktake, but actually what we really need to see is a recognition that insufficient action has taken place under Article 5, and that actually we need a proper work programme to address it. So we're trying to get that recognition into the global stocktake. There is a piece on that at the moment that we really want to hold on to, and we want to start that dialogue with parties about the importance of establishing a work programme to really operationalise Article 5. We also have some really useful language and recommendations, particularly in the adaptation context, coming forward from the IPCC. And I've included the recommendation here that effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of the Earth's land, freshwater and ocean will help ensure a healthy planet. So that's something that we've been advocating for. And when we think about the word conservation, that's not necessarily hugely helpful in decision text because we want to see a hierarchy of action. First of all, protecting those carbon stocks that we have already, then restoring them, and then looking at sustainable use. So protect, restore, and sustainable use is incredibly helpful. So I've touched on our main priorities, but there are a few other kind of elements that we would also like to see. The language around ecosystem-based adaptation is well defined, and we'd like to see that reflected in the adaptation commitments under the GST. When countries are talking, when text is put forward on ecosystems, we're constantly missing references to freshwater ecosystems. So we have land-based and marine, but freshwater needs to be in there too. And then there's a whole system, which colleagues are going to talk to very soon, which encompasses the measures to address accounting and definition flaws. So there's a system of approaches within the UNFCCC that lead us into places we don't want to be, either for nature or for climate. And I'm going to wrap there because our colleagues are actually going to talk a lot more about these problems and how they can be overcome. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Mel, and great to hear that and set the scene around this going forward. I'm now going to pass over to Professor Brendan McKee, who's Director of the Climate Action Beacon, Griffith University in Australia. He has over 300 academic publications on environmental science and policy, with a focus on the role of forest ecosystems in climate mitigation adaptation. He was a coordinating lead author in the IPCC 6 assessment report. It's over to you, Brendan.
Yes, thank you. now. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit more, following on from the first speaker. And let's look in particular at forest ecosystems. This is some new analysis we've done, which maps the density of ecosystem carbon in the world's forests in tonnes per hectare. And it's coloured by biome. So the green is tropical biome, the orange is temperate forest, and the blue is boreal. And what it shows, amongst other things, is that tropical forests are largely the domain of the least developed and emerging economy nations, and the temperate and boreal forests are very much the domain of the economically developed countries. But we can use these data to look at just how much carbon is currently stored in the world's major forest ecosystem types. And we can also look at how much of that carbon is currently protected in a protected area and how much is still at risk. So when we do that, we find that there is only about 18% of the world's forests is currently found within a protected area. If we add up all the carbon that's stored in the world's forests, we get a very large number. We get about 646 billion tonnes of carbon. Now, we can translate that into its CO2 equivalent, if that were all oxidised and put into the atmosphere. That would be, well, 2,371 gigatonne of CO2 equivalent. It is about 2.4 trillion tonnes of CO2 equivalent. That's actually not all the carbon that is stored in the world's forest ecosystems, because we don't have good data on three important pools. What I've shown you is the data on above ground living biomass and soil carbon. What's missing is below ground roots, which is another 20%. The dead biomass on the forest floor, which can be as much as the living carbon, and also peat, which in boreal forests doubles the amount again. Currently, as I said, 18% of that falls within a protected area. That's about 100 billion tonnes. We heard mention of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the 30 by 30 target, i.e. increasing the amount of ecosystems that are protected from the current level, which is, in the case of forests, 18%, to 30%. That would increase the amount of ecosystem carbon that was protected from 100 gigatonne to 250, which is about 800 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So these are extraordinary numbers when you put them in the context of the annual removals and emissions, which are the numbers I've got on the right. So currently, and again, we rarely see the numbers expressed like this, but the world's forests that we're talking about remove about 60 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year, and we lose about half of that, about 30 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent, through emissions from deforestation and degradation. So if we were to protect the world's forests such that we were to eliminate emissions from deforestation and degradation, we would be saving about 30 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year. Why is that important? Well, the global stocktake we just have received, the first global stocktake, revealed that the mitigation gap for 1.5 degrees between now and 2030 is about 80 gigatonne of CO2, which is about 3 years' worth of emissions from deforestation and degradation. So this really points to the power of natural forests in removing CO2 from the atmosphere and retaining it. Its real mitigation value is the retention of carbon within the ecosystem. But this ecosystem mitigation benefit from protecting the world's ecosystems, and I'm talking here mainly about forests, it's only realised if we maintain what scientifically we refer to as the functional role of biodiversity in the removal and retention of carbon by ecosystems. Now, this has been well documented in science and in the UN system for decades. That's a report I was a contributing author on, put up by the CBD a number of decades ago, called Forest Resilience, Biodiversity and Climate Change, a synthesis of the biodiversity, resilience, stability, relationships in forest ecosystems. And I've got two examples there. One is from the southeast Brazilian Amazon. That is you can see there's a large green area in the middle, heart-shaped. That's the tropical rainforest, which is the territorial home of the Kaiapó Tribal Alliance. And all the colours you can see around it are the human-caused fires and deforestation and logging and mining that have occurred over the last 40 years. And you can see that the western two-thirds of that territory, which is maintained by the Kaiapó Tribal Alliance, has been kept free of that human disturbance. What that means is it's maintained its biodiversity, and that biodiversity has maintained the ecosystem integrity of that forest. Now, in the case of a wet tropical forest, what that ecosystem integrity means is these forests do not naturally burn, right? They do not naturally desiccate. That only happens when humans intervene. So the Kaiapó, by preventing these illegal human incursions, enable the biodiversity to do what it does, which is to maintain its integrity. The bottom is an interesting example from a natural forest in Australia which suffered an extraordinarily severe wildfire, which you can tell because the trunks are all black, but you can see it's green. And this is a natural adaptation that evolutionary processes have produced. These trees are adapted to intense wildfires such that they have what's called epigamic growth. These buds shoot out from their trunks and branches after a fire's gone through and keep the tree alive until their canopies can regrow. So when we talk about the functional role of biodiversity in ecosystem integrity, these are two examples of what we're talking about. Of course, I could explain it in far more scientific terms, and nothing would please me more than to talk the rest of this session to give you an in-depth theoretical expose of what we're talking about, but I think those examples probably suffice. Now, the great thing is, or the useful thing is, that this concept of ecosystem integrity is not just kind of a theory or a way of explaining what we see in nature. A number of organisations and scholars and researchers have come up with evaluation frameworks that enable us to apply this concept of ecosystem integrity, to use it as a reference condition for evaluating the carbon retention value of ecosystems, because it enables us to distinguish the impact that human land use and such as logging, but other kinds of land use have on a forest's ability to remove and restore carbon. And I've got here some examples of 5 very common forest types: primary forest, secondary forest, production forest, agroforest, commercial plantations. We can define these, but we can also apply these assessment frameworks for measuring and reporting on their relative level of ecosystem integrity. So if one forest type is transformed by land use into another, we're able to register this. And I've just got some data on the right from a paper which just illustrates that when we're, of course, here at the Climate COP in particular with the global stocktake, we've got to focus on carbon, that as the level of ecosystem integrity reduces, you get a reduced stock of carbon in that forest type. The lower the level of ecosystem integrity, the less carbon stored in the forest. And the forest type that has the highest level of ecosystem integrity is primary forest, and it retains the most carbon. And our chair also made reference to the fact that we need to be reflecting this scientific understanding we have about the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem integrity and carbon stocks and carbon retention in our accounting system, which currently doesn't happen. So the current greenhouse gas inventory protocols by the IPCC and the UNFCCC are flow-based. They are based on net annual flows, which makes perfect sense for fossil fuel emissions, but it's not particularly useful for ecosystem accounting because it doesn't take into account the retained carbon stock. The retained carbon stock, if you like, is an asset on which the annual flows interact with. And this diagram here is just for some publications which show if we were to apply a stock and flow-based system, we would both see what was going into and out of the atmosphere and what was being retained in the system. I've just got there an example of a primary forest, a secondary forest in the middle, and a plantation forest. They all store carbon, but the secondary forest stores less than the primary and the plantation less than the secondary, and what's not in the ecosystem is up in the atmosphere. And a stock and flow-based accounting system will track both. It will track changes in the stock and changes in the atmosphere. The good news is we have a global standard for such a stock and flow-based accounting system. It was developed by the UN Division of Statistics, which is the peak body for national bureaus of statistics. And it's called the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounting Ecosystem Accounts. So, to conclude, it's really important when we look at the negotiations that are happening and the negotiating text we end up with, that we do have text that helps us achieve synergistic climate and biodiversity outcomes. It's really critical for the success of the Paris Agreement, and I think that's very much exemplified by the good work the Kaipo Tribal Alliance is doing. They're protecting 9.4 million hectares of primary forest, which is both a vast reservoir of biological diversity. It's also securing 1.7 billion tonnes of forest ecosystem carbon. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that, and some really interesting statistics there that we might come back to afterwards, and hopefully in the Q&A some audience want to engage on that one. But I'm going to hand over now to our next speaker. So Tegan Hansen is the Senior Forest Campaigner at Stand Earth and a member of the EPN's Biomass Action Network. She is based primarily in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in Vancouver, Canada, and she works on forest defence throughout the province of British Columbia. So over to you, Tegan.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yes, so I am going to go through a real-world example of where carbon accounting issues kind of come into play and underpin some real problems that we're seeing, especially with the global stocktake, which the UNFCCC has said is this moment when we take a good, hard look at the state of our planet and chart a better course for the future. But unfortunately, we have a carbon accounting problem that actually makes that impossible. So I'm going to talk to you about the problems with big biomass energy, highly emissive, dirty energy, which contributes to enormous human rights abuses around the world, as well as loss of biodiversity, and makes it really impossible for us to meaningfully meet renewable energy targets in a way that actually prevents runaway climate change. So we've touched on this already a little, but starting with how we count emissions. We say in the UNFCCC that we count emissions on the land. When we talk about biomass energy, this is a huge problem, which I'll get to later, but basically this theory is that forest carbon is a closed carbon cycle. You log the trees grow back, eventually the carbon is restored in forest ecosystems. It's a theory, not actually working in practice. So in my home province, so-called British Columbia, as we talked about, some very extremely important carbon-rich forests left on the planet because of millennia of cultivation and stewardship and management by Indigenous nations. Forests like this in central British Columbia, the inland temperate rainforest, are very, very rare. This is what most of the landscape looks like in British Columbia after decades of settler colonial industrial logging. So much of the stored carbon in a forest is lost at logging. That is not accounted for properly. Canada, like many countries, does not properly account forest carbon loss with logging. And in all likelihood, these forests never recover their carbon that they once stored, in part because they're often converted into plantations, which are cut on a cycle. But now increasingly, because of climate change, it's unlikely that they can recover at all in parts of the province. And so, we hear industry talk about, at least where I'm from, we hear industry talk a lot about storing carbon in wood products. This is a log yard in central British Columbia. You might think that those are logs going into conventional milling for things like 2x4s for the housing market. No, this is a log yard for a wood pellet plant that is now owned by Drax. Drax owns most of the wood pellet plants in British Columbia. Wood pellets are shipped abroad to places like Japan and the UK, where they are burned for electricity. The carbon is not accounted for at the stack when they are burned, despite the fact that it is as polluting or emits as much carbon or more than coal. But because in theory, the emissions should be counted on the land, they are not counted for at the stack. And that means that if the global stocktake is to take a good, accurate look at where we're missing a huge part of the emissions problem. And so Drax is a major proponent. Like I said, they own a majority of pellet plants now in British Columbia, and they're expanding. They are a huge utility company in the United Kingdom, a coal company, so they are underpinned by subsidies that are supposed to be going to the green energy transition, and those subsidies are keeping afloat a coal plant to degrade forests and burn wood pellets and emit as much carbon that is not counted. I'm really driving this home because it is a huge problem. We know the emissions exist, the planet knows they exist. On paper, they do not exist. So Drax is here. I took this picture from their booth. You'll often hear, like I said, these stories, these kind of fantasies about the closed carbon cycle and about carbon capture technology, unproven carbon capture technology that Drax and others are here to promote. We know that forests are our best offense and defense to the climate crisis. We do not know that capturing carbon is going to save us, and certainly for the communities that are dealing with the impacts, the health impacts from manufacturing in places like Mississippi and the US Southeast, increasingly communities dealing with land grabs as countries and companies look to fuel this supposed renewable energy solution. This is simply not the space where a company should be allowed to promote something, as erroneous and fantastical as carbon capture storage as a supposed solution. And yet they are here, I believe, in a booth that's co-sponsored by the UK government. I just really want to drive this home. The narrative that we hear often in Canada is that the industry is making use of waste that would otherwise be burned, or that they are in fact taking materials out of the forest that somehow increase the risk of fire. Not true. That's me silhouetted there with my friend in a Pinnacle Renewable Energy, which is now owned by Drax cut block. This is a typical cut block that you'll see in British Columbia. This was clear cut for pellets. This was left at the site. It is, like I said, conventional logging. This block was already, the roads were deactivated. They weren't coming back for any of the supposed waste. And the reality is that that's because they are a subsidized sector. It is cheaper for them to simply log or buy logs from other companies and turn them into pellets. So we have all of these sort of lies about this sector that are, really upheld by carbon accounting problems that are allowing biomass to get away with being classified as a renewable energy, despite the fact that it's highly emissive, as much or more than coal, despite the fact that it's contributing to these enormous problems. At COP26 in Glasgow, we heard this phrase, for the first time, nations are called upon to phase down unabated coal power. What that can sometimes mean is taking 5% to 10% of your feedstock into a power plant that would be coal and replacing it with woody biomass. Our colleagues in Indonesia, did a study on what that would look like, and it can mean, at the minimum, 2.3 million hectares of land that is degraded to fuel these power plants. And again, on paper, it looks like an emissions reduction. In practice, it is not an emissions reduction. And our planet knows, even if we won't count it. So, what are the pathways forward? We need a process for revising emissions accounting at the GST. We have to see biomass energy counted at the smokestack. We need countries to intervene to direct the UNFCCC to revise carbon accounting. My country, Canada, has historically played a role in bad policies that are driven by the forestry industry, and I would love to see Canada take a leading role in revising these carbon accounting problems or calling on them to be revised with allies. We have to see renewable energy targets that explicitly exclude biomass. When we see countries saying that they want to triple renewable energy, that should be a wonderful target. What that can mean for many communities is the increased threat of land grabs, the increased threat of health impacts, the degradation of forests, which are vital for food, for medicine, for self-determination. And like we've talked about, we need to see the importance of forest ecosystems upheld in the agreements. And that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Tegan. Really great there. I'm looking forward to, hopefully getting some more questions on that from the audience to explore this in more detail. I'm now going to hand over to our final speaker. Alexandra Deprez is a research fellow on international climate governance at IDRI, a Paris-based think tank. She has focused on linking climate and biodiversity ambitions since 2019 and the UNFCCC negotiations since COP20. Most recently, she's been working on the sustainability thresholds of land-based carbon dioxide removal. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks so much for the invitation to talk. I only have one slide. Oh, it should come. Okay. Yes, so I guess as you know, as you are aware, we're in the last moments of in the last days of the closed doors negotiations on the global stocktake text. And of course, you're all aware that one of the major issues that is being discussed is the question of fossil fuel phase out. I mean, the energy package as a whole and fossil fuel phase out. And so in all I've seen, I agree with Mel that it's really exciting after several years of being in this process to see how nature and biodiversity and ecosystems are being really more central, but often I still feel that, and the GST text at the moment reflects this, that when we think of connecting climate and biodiversity together, there is still a long way to go in really getting a full understanding and having, for instance, parties fully acknowledge that to keep the 1.5 goal in line, to be able to keep that temperature goal or overshoot as minimal as possible, we need both very ambitious reductions in emissions, and that goes through fossil fuel phase out, and also reduction, as was discussed before, of deforestation emissions and protection of biodiversity. And this, for instance, is, in my view, something that's clearly not reflected in the GST text and is a big problem. And the reason why this is really relevant, I think, is in a sense made explicit, or I hope in a sense, through this image, which basically this comes from the special report by the IPCC on 1.5. So it's already dating a little bit from 2019, but it basically shows that the several illustrative model pathways that the IPCC has put out to keep 1.5. And we see that basically some of the pathways, especially those with large overshoots such as P4, actually compensate the lack of reductions in emissions from the energy system and fossil fuels so lack of ambition now with, in coming decades, a huge dependence on carbon dioxide removal. And that, for the moment, at least in the modeled pathways of the IPCC, it's mostly BECCS, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and also afforestation, which is often, at least in pledges of countries at the moment, afforestation is often monoculture afforestation. So I think the speakers before really show how these two quote-unquote solutions that are being put forth are really problematic, and in my view, this is still a major sort of elephant in the room, or lack of, at the moment there isn't a clear understanding or acknowledgement, especially in the global stocktake, which is meant to be taking stock of the progress that we've making and being really clear about what we need to do in the coming years to keep the Paris Agreement goals. Yes, and I guess the other thing that is, again, lacking in the global stocktake texts regarding the backwards-looking acknowledgement of progress or lack of progress is the whole question of how countries are at the moment. So this is like carbon dioxide removal in the modeled pathways, but a great report launched last year and was updated this year, the Land Gap report, which Brendan, you've been contributing to, showed basically assessed that already today countries are collectively banking on depending in coming decades on a lot of carbon dioxide removal, in particular afforestation and perhaps some BECCS. And also, so there are some numbers and some, for instance, the IPCC IPBES global co-sponsored workshop report from 2 years ago put out the fact that, highlighted the fact that having very large BECCS or afforestation is very problematic, but in fact, there are more recent papers that show that even very minimal amounts of these two techniques could actually already overstep planetary boundaries. And again, I think the elements, the more concrete on-the-ground descriptions that you've been giving show that already today there are major issues on bioenergy. So how can we expect for BECCS, and already we also know, if you've been hearing the news about abatement and how there isn't at the moment a definition of what abatement means, of what are real very high standards of CCS. Over-depending on this in the future is highly problematic. Yes, and so I guess in terms of, I guess there are the things that also concerning, I guess, with regards to the current text on the global stocktake is that not only do these questions of carbon capture and storage, abatement, but also removals are sort of being put in the text in various places. In particular, one article, I think it's Article 36B, which calls for substantially scaling up globally by 2030 zero and low emission technologies, including abatement and removal technologies, including CCUS, low carbon hydrogen production. That's more about, I'm assuming, talking about removals on the technological side, but this call to basically increase substantively removals as a way to sort of offset current emissions is really not going in the right direction. So we'll see, I guess, in the next few days what comes out of that. But I think this whole question of how do we reframe the narrative around carbon dioxide removal is really important. The IPCC itself has been clear that to keep the 1.5 goal, we need some amount of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance those emissions that we really don't know how to eliminate today, even though that whole question of what are truly residual emissions is open for interpretation as well. But the problem is, but but that amount of carbon dioxide removal could be very minimal. And there are some studies that came out, including last year, showing that if we were to phase out fossil fuels, there would be enough the amount of truly natural restoration-based carbon dioxide removal could be sufficient to meet the CDR needs that we have. So I think it's important to keep in mind sort of this bigger picture also when we're talking about nature and in the GST, and just, yes, really showing that these two issues of, in my view, having worked on this question of climate and biodiversity ambitions together in the past 4 years, I think this question of really phasing out fossil fuels is truly important for if we want to keep our biodiversity goals as well, because otherwise we're, in a sense, compromising land in the future to be cut down for bioenergy and BECCS and for afforestation, potentially. And I guess maybe I'll just end. So I've been working on the basis of all this on a paper that I hope will be published in Science very shortly, in the next couple of weeks, I hope, or days. And there we really assess, on the basis of more recent literature, sort of the sustainability thresholds of carbon dioxide removal, which are much lower, I would say, than those that are presented here. And also really call for, within the 7th assessment report of the IPCC that is just starting now, that there needs to be a focus, especially in the working group 3, which is the working group of the IPCC that focuses on mitigation, to really mainstream biodiversity concerns and sustainability risks around CDR in particular, so that we can start to reframe the role of, and the amount of CDR that we have available to reach our goals. And yes, and so I guess one thing that I would love to see is for all those parties that are claiming to be champions on climate and biodiversity here at the COP, to really bring those words to also the IPCC plenary that is happening in January, and call for truly integrating biodiversity concerns within that, which is not the case at the moment. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thank you to all of our panel speakers. And it's clear that here we can see there are many different aspects across the biodiversity and climate synergistic agenda that we're trying to either, move forward or fix within the GST of things that we want to see. And it really is a really critical moment so we can get some really strong action coming out of the global stocktake. So I'm now going to move towards a more interactive section of this event, looking at if we can have some Q&A from the audience, if anyone has any key questions they want to come. We have our UNFCCC colleagues who are going to help with a roving mic around the room. It is a very big room, so we can continue to get our steps up, as we have from across this COP. This is not the COP for being lazy. But it would be great to see if anyone has any questions that they want to start with. Otherwise, I will start us off with one while you all think of those that are in your head. Anyone got one that they want to start with? Just put your hand up. We're friendly. There we go, Peg. Let's wait for our... There we go. Always nice to have friendly friends in the audience to come in with the first question. Oh, and we got one down there. Excellent.
Yeah, my question is for Professor Mackey. It occurred to me when you're talking about the carbon accounting system that you're recommending versus the carbon accounting system that we've currently got for the land and forest sector in the UNFCCC, that a good analogy might be when you're basically having to do your financial accounts. You have your profit and loss statement, which would be like your emissions up and your removals down, and you have your asset register, which would be your carbon stocks. And I wonder whether if we explained it that way, people might begin to understand what on earth we're talking about. So I just wondered if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy and a very accurate one. And in that UN system of environmental economic accounting ecosystems account, which is abbreviated to SEA by the people who use it, that's precisely what they're talking about. So the SEA system is designed to enable the contribution of ecosystem services to the national economy to be registered in the national economic accounts. And ecosystems are actually registered as an asset, which is very important for developing countries because it helps with their balance of trade, right? I mean, all of a sudden they've got more assets in their national accounts. And also, if your annual flows from those, if you're getting flows from those accounts which are depleting the accounts, that'll be registered. And that's the problem at the moment, right? So with the example we saw in the BC, we've got old growth forests being chipped and turned into pellets and put in ships and taken across the oceans to the UK, where they're fed into a power station to generate electricity, and the loss of that carbon stock really, none of the loss of that carbon, if you like, is registered in the US, in Canada, and it's not registered in the UK either, right? Because it's counted as clean energy, right? It's clean energy, right? Now, as you mentioned, if you burn woody biomass in a power station, out of the stack, it's more emissive per unit of energy produced than coal. You're actually better off burning coal. So we have an accounting system that enables these failings, and part of the solution is having an accounting system that recognises the retained stock of ecosystem as an asset.
Yeah, thanks for that. Really good answer, and really highlighting, the different complexities there are around trying to fix these problems and things as well. Our question down the end here. And if you could just introduce yourself as well when you ask the question, so we know where you're from and who you are, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. My name is Anna Locke. I'm from ODI, formerly known as the Overseas Development Institute. And I had two questions, actually, both a little bit about how to connect the research that you're doing with influencing outcomes. And I wondered, here we're sitting talking about gaps in the global stocktake text, while negotiators are, as we speak, actually negotiating the text. And I saw the version from the 8th, and it does not address the issues that you're talking about. So I just wondered how you're trying to influence that text to get some of the key points that you're raising here. The second thing was on carbon removal. I spent some time at the Investment COP and the Innovation COP, and the two main things that were being talking about was, one, use carbon as money. The second one was there was just increasing talk, much more bullish talk than I've heard before, about carbon removal being a more equal partner in the fight against climate change, with the phrase often being used was all hands on deck, and taking the position that it won't distract from emissions reduction. What kind of, how would you advise on engaging with this community and using your research? What are the top 3 points and numbers that you think need to be put out there? Thank you. Or maybe you feel that there is some room for carbon removal. I'd really love to know your positions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to go for Mel, if you want to respond to the first question, and then maybe between the three of you, I almost feel you could cover the second question after that. So I might go to you in different order, if that's okay. And you can have a chance to think of a response while Mel covers the first one. So Mel.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question on how we actually influence this process. So a number of us here work as part of Climate Action Network, which has an ecosystems working group. And in order to try and get the kind of proposals that we want to see in the text, we actually develop draft text ourselves. So we decide what principles we want to see land, and those are the ones I shared in my presentation. But then we work those into suggested text proposals, paragraphs, which we share with negotiators ahead of COP. And indeed, we did that in Bonn and ahead of the Global Stocktake workshops in October, and then coming into COP28 as well. Of course, as soon as we see the first draft text iteration, then we're no longer just proposing what we'd like to see, but we're responding to that. So then we come up with amendments and suggestions around the text proposals where we see gaps, where we think they could be strengthened. And then we share those with parties. We know that there are some parties who are real champions for this. We know that there are some parties who are in the persuadable space. So we work hard to ensure that parties are kind of cited on those proposals, and we get feedback and try and understand the politics around it as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Like, really great response to that. If anyone else on the panel wants to come in on that one, otherwise we'll move into Alex, and then we'll go into question 2 after Alex.
Yes, I think so. Regarding the question of influencing the process, I think on my end, my concern on precisely safeguards around carbon dioxide removal. And so one of the things is carbon dioxide removal is very different from carbon capture and storage. But here it is in the text, it is being mixed up. And so in advance of this COP, this is why I was very concerned also about the whole question of abatement and how, and so I think, so I've been trying to develop text or in talking with different party groupings around sort of doing the most damage control on this. And I think especially the paragraph that I read out, paragraph 36B, is highly problematic in my view, because it's calling for a substantial scale up of these technologies, which could include also nature-based, or land-based carbon dioxide removal. And this is totally dissociated from the IPCC science, which says that the first priority is to cut our emissions, and that goes through a major phase out of fossil fuels. So I'll let Brendan and Tegan respond, and happy to then come back on the other second part. Thanks.
Yeah, so that's a really important point about distinguishing between natural ecosystems removal and carbon capture and storage technology. So in my presentation, I did cite that fact that natural removals by naturally regenerating forests is about, the gross removals is about 15 gigaton of carbon, right? Annually, but we lose half of that through emissions from deforestation and degradation. But wait, there's more, because much of the world's forest has been intensively logged, if not trashed, since the 1970s. And I'm not just talking about deforestation in the tropics. I look particularly to the boreal, and we can look particularly there to Sweden and Canada and Russia, where they have been clear felling and wood chipping for pulp, paper, for many, many, many decades. So from a removal point of view, those forests are way below their natural carbon carrying capacity, right? So if that were to cease at any substantial scale, we'd get much more than 15 gigaton gross removals a year. I'll just make an additional point. Even if we look at the world's old growth forest, it's still, the old growth alone is still pulling down about at least 1 gigaton of CO2 a year. Plus, as I said, much of the world's forests in the boreal in particular, but also the temperate forests and a lot of the tropical forests, which have been selectively logged for their big old trees where most of the carbon is, are well below their natural carbon capacity. So we really cannot ignore the removal potential that's in the world's forests. And really that's got to be the priority I believe, before we start looking at unproven carbon capture storage.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brendan. Going on to the second part of the question around how we can overcome these dangerous distractions. Tegan, do you want to come in?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm just going to repeat what Brendan said with a, slightly more emphasis on certain points, because it really is true that these distractions are being used in practice to justify destruction. If we were, we're not talking about we're in the process of a phase out and we're ensuring that these ecosystems are protected in the hands of Indigenous nations. We're letting companies put these technologies over top of ongoing destruction and over top of ongoing resource extraction. And so that's the problem. I think if we need, first of all, as Brendan was saying, to ensure these places are protected, to ensure, as Alex said, we're in a phase out of fossil fuels. And then I think we can look at these technologies with a little bit more trust. But at this moment, that's not the real world that we're living in, and that's certainly not what many lobbyists are here promoting at this COP.
Yeah. Oh, I thought that was a... Yeah, Brendan, you want to come back in?
Yeah, just to follow on from both of those comments, I mean, to me, if we're going to have any wording about phase down of unabated fossil fuel, I think, as you were saying, it can only be about looking at the residual emissions after you've gone through a phase-out process. You've gone through the mitigation hierarchy with the aim of phasing out, and you will be left with residual emissions, and then there could be a role for that. But that's also after you've gone through what we can in terms of maximising the natural removals.
Yeah, Alex. I can see our panelists are loving this question.
Yes. So regarding, I think, carbon dioxide removal, in my perspective, I've been trying to do work on defining sort of key principles for a science-based approach that also really takes into account the sustainability dimension. Because at the moment, as I was explaining, the IPCC is very clear that as you said, there needs to be a mitigation hierarchy, which goes first with reducing emissions before we start talking about carbon dioxide removal. But however, the IPCC is still at the moment putting out technical mitigation potential levels of carbon dioxide removal, like basically saying this is the amount of carbon dioxide removal will be available in terms of gigatons. They're drawing that from underlying literature that, in particular for instance, BECCS and afforestation, does not account for sustainability risk. So you get these numbers of saying, oh, BECCS you could have up to 11 gigatons removed from BECCS with no consideration of how much land that would require, what are all the consequences. So for me, in terms of reframing, and then the fact that these potentials are presented as so high feeds into the narratives that, honestly, what I would call the growing CDR lobby, and people who are pushing for this, not just suppliers of CDR, but academics and others who are in this CDR ecosystem. Following this for a couple of years, I still do not see these people, these colleagues, taking as a starting point the sustainability potential of CDR and the sustainability risks. And so, in my view, putting that up front is really necessary, and that requires, this is why this is why I've written this paper, which I hope will contribute to the discussion of saying this needs to be integrated within the next IPCC cycle, and in advance of that, also made more clear for parties in advance of the NDCs that they will be putting out. There really needs to be this focus that at the moment, everything that we've been hearing about CDR being the solution does not account for the impacts on the ground, and so we need to scrutinize that much more clearly. And then once you have these two starting points of first priority is emission reductions and fossil fuel phase out, and then also that there's a limited supply of CDR, that then, in my view, from that you can reframe governance to say, hence, limited CDR, it's a limited and scarce resource that needs to be used for the most priority uses, which is counterbalancing hard to abate, like truly hard to abate and limited residual emissions, and then also counterbalancing overshoot. And I think the fact that there's a limited supply of CDR, it reinforces the point that we need to limit overshoot as much as possible, not just because of the impacts, irreversible impacts that overshoot will have, but because it also emphasizes that reversing overshoot, which the IPCC says is theoretically possible, is actually really difficult. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks for that really comprehensive answer from all of our panelists, which is great to see. Anyone else have a question in the audience? Yeah, at the back there.
Yeah, hi everyone. Alex Mackiness from RSPB. My question was about, well, given the looming issue of runaway climate change, my question was about the durability and resilience of natural carbon removal systems, like forests, and how we might think about negating the impacts of runaway climate change. And I just also wanted to throw in an additional point around the fact that obviously a lot of the justification for engineered removals is often built upon permanence and the ability to kind of buffer against that climate impact moving forward. So just interested in the panel's perspective on that.
Yeah, over to you, Brendan.
Yeah, so on the technological side, I mean, where's the evidence that capturing CO2 and liquefying it and pumping it into a cavity in the ground is permanent? And all the literature I've read says it will leak. Even if the leakage rate's 1% a year, it's just a delayed emission, you know. So permanent means permanent. So I haven't seen any evidence, and all the researchers I've talked to who work in this space, they've said they've never claimed that the storage will be permanent. We hear a lot about the capture, right, but very little about the storage because we really haven't done it at scale. So that's the first point on that. In terms of the natural removals, we are talking about a fundamental component of the global carbon cycle, right? There's always been ecosystems. There always will be ecosystems. Biodiversity and evolution means that they will always be dynamic, and systems will always be adjusting to prevailing conditions, and they never have and never will remain the same. The main thing is that we don't clear the whole planet of them and concrete over the whole terrestrial world, because then there'll be no ecosystems, right? And there'll be no ecosystem storage. So yes, ecosystems will change dramatically if we fail to limit global warming and as climate change increases. But this gets us back to the role of biodiversity in ecosystem function. The more, if you like, we can spiral up or we can spiral down. The more we protect biodiversity now, the more we take human pressures off existing ecosystems, the more we retain their adaptive capacity and their resilience, etc. Of course, as climate change, the more we fail to limit global warming, the more rapidly certain ecosystems will transform and we'll see this collapse. The most obvious one is shallow tropical coral reefs, right? They're very sensitive to marine heat waves and coral bleaching. It takes about 10 years for a tropical coral reef, hard coral reef, to recover from a bleaching. So once you start to get 2 or 3 bleaching events a decade, what will happen to them? Well, you won't have a hard coral reef ecosystem. You'll have some soft coral, there'll be a lot more macroalgae, etc. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I think you get the gist of my answer.
Yeah, thanks for that. Tegan, you want to come in as well?
I'll just add, I touched on this briefly, but I think it's worth repeating and hopefully stays on with your question. But I've heard a lot of really concerning narrative this COP around needing to manage fuels in forests because they're prone to burning. I was showing you images of forests. Many forests in British Columbia, Western Canada have natural fire cycles and are supposed to burn. And in fact, First Nations have managed them for years with fire. However, because of, yes, climate change is a factor, but also because of industrial logging, these places are now extremely prone to fire. And in fact, the most important thing that we can do to ensure that these forests are resilient to fire and to emitting more carbon is to protect old forests that are still standing, to restore and to use fire in a limited capacity to manage them. And that will be more of a success for mitigating emissions than logging. But proponents are really pushing harvesting now as the solution to those high emission mega fires. We just had a record-breaking year for fires in British Columbia. And so I think, again, this is where having the science to back up those important truths is really key. And for me as a campaigner, we have to make sure that that's taken seriously at the political level.
Yeah, thanks for that. Could we just have a question over here? There's a microphone here. And you could just introduce yourself and where you're from.
Yes, I'm Catherine Eglin from the United States, and I'm really happy to hear someone respond about not much being said about the carbon storage, part of the carbon capture and storage. I happen to live in the energy ratepayer district as in what would have been the world's largest carbon sequestration plant, a failed $7.5 billion debacle. This is a very expensive, risky, experimental, unproven process. And you're capturing the carbon and injecting it underground. With that comes all kinds of things with leaks in the pipe. There's only so much underground rock sedimentation that you can pump the carbon into. So where do you go from there after you've invested all of this money? And one thing I think we really need to emphasize that we're further proliferating the use of coal because, this has been branded as clean coal, and again, it's something that's clean and renewable, but it is still dirty energy.
Yeah, thanks for that. Got some claps from the panel up here. Which one of you want to take that first? Is that you, Alex? Or is that a panicked face? Yeah.
Well,
Brendan, you want to come in?
Let's chat afterwards because, one of the things we lack are, documentation of the impacts of all these trial projects that are going on. I know in Australia the government similarly is subsidising very large-scale carbon capture and storage plants in parallel with new fracking and gas mining activities. So, yeah, this is happening everywhere, so I'm very interested to hear your experiences of that.
Yeah, thanks for that. Oh, yeah. Dr. Joseph, good to see you in the room. I've got a microphone over here.
Thank you. So I'm Joseph Onoja, and I'm from the Nigerian Conservation Foundation, a BedLife partner in Nigeria. And talking about integrating biodiversity and climate, I think it's good for me to say this caution, and it's something that we should, I feel we should take this holistically, because I think Keenan, her name, I came in when she was making her final thoughts, and she talked about renewables, because we may run into the risk of replacing biodiversity with renewables, because if you take solar as an example, you will need land to be able to put the solar on. You will need expansion of these facilities. Where are they going to be? Are they going to be replacing biodiverse areas for these things? And for the batteries that are going to be running these renewable energies, they are going to be sourced from areas that have been known to be biodiverse. Apart from the biodiversity impact, they have the human impact, the social impact, and so on, because these areas have been known to lead to abuses, human rights abuses. So I think in talking about this, we should take it in holistically And also we should look at the renewable energies from the beginning to the end, from the sourcing to the shelf life and to the disposition of it. So all of these things, I think, needs to be handled in comparison so that we don't lose the idea. I try to look back when plastics were discovered as a solution. Nobody thought that plastic would be a menace today. So I think if we track back and look at renewables also from that angle, it will also help us to look at these things holistically. So that's just what I want to throw up there, so that we don't look at climate solutions at the detriment of biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Mel, do you want to take that one? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph. Such an important point. And there's this constant tension between what's required from our land as we seek to address the climate crisis. I mean, I think in the broader energy system, prioritizing reducing the demand for energy and energy efficiency as the kind of first point of intervention is super important to try and minimize those conflicts. Then, of course, planning where things go in a strategic way so that you can kind of minimize those tensions and trade-offs is really important. I think the solar industry is an interesting example because there are tremendous opportunities in the urban environment to do much more with solar without having to take land that could be used for biodiversity or for other needs. And there are opportunities, if done really well, for solar and biodiversity to be compatible if you manage the site in the appropriate way so that you can have nature alongside renewables. So there are certainly some options, but there's a bit of a hierarchy of approaches to make sure that that lands successfully. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Anyone else want to come in on that one? No? Any other questions in the room? Oh, yeah, at the back here. It's great to see such an interactive audience.
Hi, I'm So-Mang from Solutions for Our Climate. We're a climate advocacy group based in South Korea, and we're also a part of the Biomass Action Network. So I wanted to ask the panelists, do you think that the role of biologically diverse forests have been somewhat, I guess, underestimated or underappreciated in fighting climate change? Because I think, there is this whole narrative of, I guess, valuing biodiversity for its own sake rather than because biodiverse and native forests actually, act as more of a carbon sink. And I'm very disturbed to see a lot of companies that are talking about, moving to paper-based packaging rather than plastic, talk about, oh, don't worry, the demand for trees will rise, but we'll just afforest, we'll just plant more trees somewhere else, as though one forest is equivalent to another, right? To 1,000-year-old, very diverse and old forest. So do you think that it's appreciated, and how do we fight that narrative? Thank you.
Yes, it's a very good observation and a true observation on your part, I think, and a good question, because it opens up this whole issue of definitions that we raised at the beginning. So under the definition, so under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the IPCC guidelines, etc., and various decisions at numerous COPs, there is an official definition of forests, which is got nothing to do with biodiversity. It's a simple structural definition. A forest is an area of at least, I forget the minimum area, it might be a hectare, and it has a canopy density of 10%, and the trees at maturity are at least 2 metres. Okay, so it's a minimal definition. Okay, a forest can be any trees which cover at least a hectare, are at least 2 metres high at maturity, and their canopy covers 10% of that area. Now, on what planet that's a forest, I don't know, but in planet UNFCCC, that's a forest. So it makes no mention of biodiversity or anything ecological. So under that definition, that wet tropical rainforest that's being protected by the Kayapo Tribal Alliance is a forest, and a palm oil plantation in Indonesia is a forest, right? So if you're reporting on deforestation under the UNFCCC, you can replace a primary forest with a palm oil plantation and there's been no deforestation. So if you like, we've had a under the UN system, we've had a definition of forests where all forests are equal. And this is why this concept of ecosystem integrity is so important, and why one of the priorities was to have that referenced in the text, because ecosystem integrity and having a means to assess that and using that as some kind of reference level enables us to make that distinction.
Thanks for that. Tegan, do you want to? No? Yeah? Yeah. Come in.
Sure, why not? Yeah, this is a huge issue that we see as well in Canada. I think it's no surprise because unfortunately the most biologically diverse forests are often also home to the most timber values. And so with conventional logging, we've seen those places really targeted. It's, British Columbia, the westernmost province of Canada, has the highest rate of biodiversity in Canada, also the highest rate of extinction, and a very large timber industry, and now a very large wood pellet export industry. And so valuing these forests properly is key. I think that unfortunately, Canada has really pushed forward problematic definitions of forest degradation, for instance, to equate plantations or second growth or forests that aren't as biologically rich with natural old growth primary standing forests, however we want to call them. And it really also undermines the really extraordinary value of these forests for Indigenous nations who have deep relations with these forests, for food, for medicines, for flood mitigation, for fire mitigation, all the things that we're talking about in this era of climate crisis. So yes, it's a huge issue, and one that countries like Canada especially have a strong responsibility to push hard at these international forums to change.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? We've got 12 minutes and 30 seconds left of our session, so still time for more questions if you have any. Yep, Virginia, just wait for the microphone to come down. Want to make sure everyone can hear you properly.
Thank you. Professor Mackey, I think it would be helpful for the audience to actually explain the evidence that's emerging globally about the impact of logging older forests on fire severity, which is a critically important issue now as the climate changes and climate-related fires increase.
Yeah, thanks. That's, it's a, excuse me, a controversial issue because over the last decades there's been a lot of conflicting reports about what are the factors. It's not so much what makes a wildfire occur or not, because that's really largely the fire weather. Fire weather is how dry it is, how hot it is, and basically how windy it is. But of course, you also need fuel, so you need vegetation, and you also need ignition. Most fires are actually started by lightning, but of course, where you've got people start fires as well. The vegetation side, of course, is a function of natural processes, but also forest management or land management generally. So with climate change, the question arises as well, what's driving what? And it isn't so much whether a fire occurs or not, because for a fire to occur, you need all those triggers pulled, if you like. The critical issue here is the severity with which the fire burns, and it's called the fire burn severity. And that's a measure of how much of the vegetation is consumed in a wildfire. So it's the difference between a low severity burn is just a small amount of the ground cover burns versus a high severity fire where the entire forest is consumed from the canopy right through to the forest floor. And what we're seeing in recent decades is an increase in the burn severity, amongst other things. Now, with climate change and global warming, human-influenced climate change and global warming, we're seeing an increase in dangerous fire weather conditions. So leaving all other factors aside, we're getting hotter temperatures, we're getting deeper droughts, and especially in winter and in spring. So when the fire season starts, the vegetation is more flammable. And this really becomes the key factor. It's not, as climate change increases, as fire weather conditions get more extreme, the amount of fuel becomes less relevant, and what becomes important is the flammability of the fuel, which means how much moisture there is in it. So anything which makes the forest more flammable, i.e. drier, is going to make it more prone to more severe fires. So evidence is now emerging in all forest types, in boreal forests, temperate forests, and tropical forests, that commercial industrial logging of forests is making the forest drier, the forest environment, microenvironment, if you like, drier, and the vegetation more flammable, and hence more susceptible to high severity burns. And that's been the case. As I said, evidence is now coming out in all forest biomes that that's the case. So it's complex interaction, but for example, in the boreal, the industrial logging, as we've seen, is making the forest younger than what it would be naturally, and the younger forest is proving to be more flammable and more fire prone and burning at higher severity. So that's the basic kind of relationship that's going on.
That's great, yeah. I'm going to pass the floor here in our audience for one final question, and then I'm going to put our panellists on the spot and ask them for one final key message they would like to send to the parties and ministers in the negotiating rooms right now on these issues. Any last question from anyone? No, we've exceeded the end of our imaginations of our questions here, but obviously we can catch our speakers for any discussions at the end of the event. So I'm now going to run down the panel for your one key message to send to the negotiating rooms on these solutions, distractions, and how we can go forward.
Great, thanks, Rhiannon. I think my one key message would be to land all the excitement around nature that we've heard at COP28 in the global stocktake, and for that to be represented by clear linkages in the text from this process, the UN climate process, into the UN CBD process, and clear references to the global biodiversity framework. I think that will help unlock a lot of the solutions that we want to see. Thank you.
That's a good answer. I don't know if I can...
I mean, you can steal it. That's fine, yeah.
Well, I just would love to see some clarity, and people accepting what the science has to say about the role of natural removals and the carbon retention value of ecosystems, because that's what's really missing here.
Tegan.
We need to stop burning forests for fuel, and so we'd like to see delegates at this COP call for changes to carbon accounting mechanisms that are underpinning the big biomass energy sector, and change those so that we're counting biomass emissions at the stack, and that we're actually not warming our planet by burning forests for electricity.
Yeah, good one. And Alex, to finish us off, bring us home.
Yes, I guess I would say we've been hearing a lot from a large variety of parties, including the presidency, that we need to keep the 1.5 alive. And I would like to see all the parties that are calling for that to actually acknowledge that that requires fossil fuel phase out and also halting deforestation, because a lot of parties are getting away with saying that they're keeping 1.5, but are actually supporting neither or of those solutions. So yeah, a bit more integrity would be welcome. Thanks.
Thanks all. Thanks everyone. I'm going to wrap us up there. Please give a big round of applause for our panelists.